Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again. It's about 10:20 on a chilly winter Sunday morning. So, hope everyone's doing good. I really want to give a big thanks and shout out to Spencer Roulard, who did an amazing job. I had him as a guest. We did a video interview in person yesterday afternoon on Saturday, and yeah, he did such an awesome job. Really informative, really interesting. We talked all about uh, sound design and soundtracks, film composers, and how that's like act it really in on its own, even on its own terms, acts as like a character for the film and for films. And Spencer Roulard is a pretty amazing artist. He has a project or a band, if you want to call it that, Method for Madness, and he does this modular based music. We met actually, well, now last year we met in August this past summer, and we were in correspondence for a while, and we had a mutual love and appreciation for music. That's what brought kind of us together. And over a few weeks or so, we ended up talking about maybe playing some shows together. We shared some music with each other, and then we ended up playing a couple shows together later that like in the fall. We did a really big show at Ada's, and that was a total blast. We did a show with his project Method for Madness, and we had my band Quantum play, and then my buddy Halsey who played, and it was a really great time. And he opened up the whole show and kicked everything off, and then we did another uh, gig together after that where we got to play together. But it was really cool because we did something different, and it was very different for me where we each kind of played a little bit of a set, but then we played together. And also, the other thing that was new for me was in that context of doing the quantum stuff. I've never really done that so much, especially I've done that a little bit with other musicians and related to like maybe a traditional guitar player or a bass player and percussion and things like that. But it was the first time for me to collaborate with another electronic artist and to just like have that as our canvas, and it was awesome. So, and over time we've gotten to know each other, and we had this real. We started talking a lot about film, and he knew about. I had talked with him about this movie channel, Film Fanatic, and how films are provide a real deep source of inspiration for me personally and artistically. And he also alluded to that, the films are the same thing for him. So we had this idea of like, why don't we do a show together on Film Fanatic, do the interviews, do an interview segment, because I've talked about that in the past, where doing those interviews and doing interviews and that, or just doing interviews in general, is kind of my favorite part of doing this whole channel. So we did our show. We did a show yesterday, and it was great. We covered a lot of topics, and I almost feel like it might warrant us to do like a part two because we covered a lot of territory. But it was super interesting, super fascinating hearing his whole perspective. And again, that's the thing that I love about doing interviews is you bringing in people and folks that have various backgrounds and also a very different perspective. He comes from a very different perspective and background than I do, with his real immersion and experience working with modular. So it was great. So that was awesome, and Thanks to people checking out the video, and we'll see about maybe doing a part two. So, and one of the other things that I talk about, one of the other things that I love about this, about doing this show and this channel and everything that I do film related, is about discovering filmmakers and films that I've never really seen before, or maybe it's a director that I might have seen one or two of his films, and it might have been during, when I was a kid, during the VHS days, and then now when I buy movies, and I've become a pretty avid collector of Blu-rays and DVDs. I go down this kind of rabbit hole and I discover all of these other filmmakers. One of the biggest examples for me has always been my favorite Italian director, Lucio Fulci. He was definitely a director and filmmaker that I knew a lot about when I was a kid growing up. My introduction to horror was the Friday the 13th franchise created by Sean Cunningham, and then also Halloween created by John Carpenter. And as far as that was like my introduction to like American horror or American slasher films when I was a kid. And that was during the time of the VHS craze. I was a kid during the 80s. So like many other people, as a family, we would go to, video stores. And the magical part for me was always, going down the aisles and seeing, and always going directly to the horror section. And seeing all of these, great covers, all the just, movies that just had the most like eye-popping artwork. Very similar to shopping for records or shopping for music. The same kind of thing of where you're going through the bins and you come across a band or bands that you've never seen before, but you've heard maybe good things about, or that they're kind of maybe in the same style of bands that you are fans of already. But overall, it's that tactile thing. It's something you can pick up and hold, and it's usually the artwork that grabs your attention. So it was always the same experience for me then, and it's the same experience for me now with searching out films. But Lucio Fulci was one of those directors where, as a kid, I started to watch a lot of his films: House by the Cemetery, The Gates of Hell, Zombie, a whole bunch of other movies. Like those are movies that I used to see a lot as a kid. And many, many years went by, and then just within the last few years, I kind of rediscovered him again. And I've been buying a lot of those classic films that I saw as a kid. I've been buying them on Blu-ray. And so it's caused me to check out even more of his films. And since then, I've bought a lot of Lucio Fulci movies and continue to do so, uh, you know, right up until fairly recently. And there's still lots of titles I want to get. But the cool thing is, like, he was like my gateway to my introduction to the horror exploitation world, to the giallo world, all of the and a ton of other Italian directors, and also other foreign directors. Dario Argento was another director too that I grew up, knowing a lot about and seeing a lot of his films. So the same thing happened for me with this other amazing director who I've just recently gotten into. And again, it was one of those things of where there was a few of his films that I saw as a kid, but I wasn't really familiar with him as a director, but there were a few films of his that I saw. And now, with my reintroduction to the horror exploitation world, it's been amazing, and it's opened up this whole other world of exploring other directors and other films I have never seen. But then it's also reintroduced me to filmmakers that I, you know, that filmmakers and their films and their various films that I used to see when I was a kid. And Jess Franco is one of them. He's like just an incredible director. Probably the most prolific director that I really know of. It's kind of insane how many films that he created, and he was a Spanish director. He was a specialist in the world of exploitation. He floated all over the place. It could be said too. Primarily, most of his films were in the horror realm, but he also did, crime exploitation, sex exploitation. Did a lot of giallo films, but all of his films always seem to have had. They always seem to have some kind of horror element. So that's been a really amazing rediscovery of his work. But I never realized how large his the like how incredibly vast and how many films that he put out throughout his career. And Jess Franco was a real famous Spanish director, or at least famous in the kind of world of exploitation. But I just recently, so I've been buying quite a few of his films, and again, it's the same thing. I started out buying certain films of his that I remember seeing as a kid. One movie in particular that I remember seeing as a kid, and it always like just really freaked me out, and I just thought it was just amazing. And I did a show on it. This film called Facelift. I just recently bought that on Blu-ray, and that's such an amazing movie, and that's one of his later films. And a handful of his other films also I had seen in passing when I was a kid. But the main thing is that it's made me focus on checking out a lot of his work, and it's been amazing. Like I've just, you're talking as far as the sheer amount of, the size or the scope of the body of work that he put out is like staggering. I mean, you're over 100 films. There's a couple of guys like Moods 616, who's a Canadian YouTube guy who really does an amazing job with really exploring, all things exploitation. He's a really huge Jess Franco fan, and I believe Jess Franco is like his favorite director. And he was talking. I just saw one of his shows recently, and he was talking about he's up to about number 90, I think 89 or 90. He's got about 89 or 90 of his films. And he is really well versed in all things exploitation, Mood 616, and especially Jess Franco. And he was even saying, being that he's like this hardcore fan and seeks out all of his movies and has multiple copies of his films, even for him, he says it's kind of staggering how much work there is that he put out. Like, it's just crazy. So I've been, obviously been buying some of his films, and I have a pretty decent collection. I have probably about 5 or 6 of his films, that Jess Franco directed. He was primarily a director, but he also produced films. He worked on in various different facets of filmmaking. My first film of his that I bought was a film called Angel of Death, and I believe he produced that film and was also involved with the writing of that film. It wasn't a film he directed, but that was technically the first movie I bought of his on Blu-ray. And I did a show on Angel of Death a couple of months ago, which is such an awesome, gritty, dirty movie, and it's like a Nazi exploitation film. Came out in the early 80s. Such an awesome movie. So that was kind of my first movie of his that I saw that he was involved in. And since then, I've been seeking out the films that that he wrote and that he also directed, and so it's been an amazing ride. And just recently, I bought The Mansion Mansion of the Living Dead, and I have to say this is one of the most bizarre movies I've ever seen in my life, but at the same time, one of the most amazing movies. This was a film, and there's probably about two or three of his films that I bought that I have seen. Facelift and a couple other ones that I remember seeing as a kid. But that was really it. And so rediscovering him, realizing that as how prolific he was, and really consistent. I feel like all of the films I've seen of his, he, was a really consistent director, and he really played with genre and like kind of intentionally tried to mess with it and not give you, like you can take your typical like tropes, say of for action movies, or probably more in this case dealing with horror, and you have like your standard kind of tropes of where there's always going to be maybe a resolution in the story or something that's going to happen that you're going to predict. There's always going to be the classic killer with the mask or the classic killer with the gloves, like the thing characteristics from like the Giallo film. And there's always going to be a certain kind of narrative or a level maybe of where it's kind of predictable, where there's going to be the setting could be a group of teenage girls that all get kind of slaughtered, and it's set up to be this like kind of classic, but by the numbers kind of slasher film. The more and more I learn about Jess Franco, and the more I dive into his work, he'll take all those things like that kind of, just for example, like the slasher concept, which slasher films are probably my favorite, and those are my favorite films in the world of exploitation. But he'll take that kind of traditional format where there's like a mass killer and there's like teenagers, there's lots of sex and boobs, and they're the group of teenagers or young people are they're in a cabin somewhere, or they're at some kind of resort, or they're traveling somewhere, and they one by one they get picked off, and there's like for slasher films there's a formula to that. What I've been discovering with Jess Franco is that he'll take that kind of format or that setting and he'll kind of turn it on its head. He'll take it intentionally into directions that don't normally fit in that typical narrative or storyline or what have you in the slasher genre. He'll like mess with it, and he'll introduce different things. Suddenly the story will go in completely in a different direction. He'll also introduce like a real surrealistic quality, a very unusual quality where it could be like a dream sequence, or you're not sure if that character is actually present and awake. So he always like kind of messed with genre. From what I've gathered, like his earlier career, he made more traditional based horror films, but later on he started taking these really elaborate risks. And the further his career went on, he had smaller budgets on a lot of his films, so he had a lot of limitations. So he decided to kind of embrace that, but then at the same time, it feels like he really, because he had these financial limitations as a director, and plus he was so prolific, he decided to embrace that and do something totally different. He didn't have the budget or the copious amounts of gore that, say, Dario Argento would have in his films, or Lucio Fulci, or Bruno Mattei, or any of the great Italian directors. So he did have that in a lot of his films, but there was a time where he didn't have a budget to do that. So he decided to try to kind of to a degree like reinvent the wheel of what a slasher film could be, or how he would introduce uh, the violent nature or the violent aspect that could be in some of his films. Super fascinating. And it's a this like I said, Mansion of the Living Dead. I've never seen before. This is my first time, so I bought this. I bought this last week for the first time, and this came out in 1985, and it stars Lino Rome, Antonio Mayans, Elisa Vela, Mabel Escano, Albino Grazzini, and it's exclusively a Spanish cast. And like I said, this movie is definitely one of the most bizarre movies I've ever seen. And the thing that's so wild about this movie is that it's essentially, if you look at the cover and the artwork, it's essentially like a zombie movie, but it has none of your typical it doesn't have any of this typical stereotypical settings or tropes that you see in a zombie film. Like if you look at George Romero, there's not really that idea of where there's only a few humans left and they're trying to survive amongst the zombies, and they're picking off the zombies one by one, and the zombies are capturing the humans that they can, and eating their brains or eating their flesh, and that typical thing where there's lots of copious amounts of gore. This essentially is a zombie movie, but it's so completely and utterly different in so many ways. It like ties in religious symbolism. There's a really heavy surrealistic quality. There's the whole film. This whole film feels like it's like a dream, where you're not really sure that with the characters and the way the narrative is kind of laid out in this film. You're not really sure if these characters are awake or in this like weird sleeping state. And the other thing too is this film, like just from like the first, like just 5 or 10 minutes in, it's so freaking sleazy. Like it's unbelievable, and it's really funny too. There's a few moments in the film and a few aspects of the film, particularly around this group of girls that go to this hotel where all of these bizarre things start happening, where it's kind of comical and it's really funny, but this movie is ultra sleazy. It's definitely one of the most sleazy movies I've seen recently, and probably just in general. I mean, it's pretty rough and pretty down and dirty. There are The other thing too is this movie is like highly disturbing, and there's not again it's essentially at face value, essentially it's a zombie movie, but it doesn't have zombies eating brains and eating flesh. It goes into very different directions. Um, but at the same time, it's an incredibly disturbing film. It's pretty rapey. This movie, I would say, is probably not for the faint at heart. There are, scenes of incredibly gratuitous sex, and there are rape scenes in this film, and they are very long. Uh, and so it's not something for the faint at heart. If you have say a lower tolerance as a viewer, it would probably get under your skin, and you probably couldn't really watch it. And on the other hand of this film, Jess Franco is known for shooting a lot of his films in these like amazing locations, just using these really exotic areas in the country, or all around the world, or finding these amazing places in Europe, and locations like in Spain, which was his home country. So he always did this thing where like I feel when you watch his films, the architecture of the particular buildings. Uh, a lot of his films that I've seen have taken place in these like really interesting hotels or like on the beach, or these wild structures, these giant houses or these mansions, but they just have this. The architecture is just really unusual, and it feels like you're watching or seeing a almost like a surrealist painting. And the architecture and the cinematography and the locations for his films, and especially this film in particular, really they really take on this thing of where they feel like they're characters in the movie, and it's a real integral part of like creating this feeling of where it's foreboding or gorgeous and lush and beautiful, or incredibly creepy and kind of horrific. And I love that, like with this film too, it has like a level of where it's so unpredictable where it's going to go. There's moments where you think, okay, I can kind of see what's going to happen, and maybe 5 minutes from now, this is where things might go. Because in a traditional sense, getting back to say like more of a formulaic view of how certain horror films are done, or slasher films in particular, or zombie movies, especially zombie movies. There's a certain formula for them. You kind of expect certain things. If you're a fan of zombie films, you pay for that typical. You pay your ticket, or or your purchase is to see those tropes, the flesh-eating zombies, and there's a formula to that. But with Jess Franco, it's it's all outside the box. Like you never know. And this was the first time I'd ever seen this, and I just watched it last night for the first time. And again, like it's a total uh, bizarre roller coaster ride. There at there were no moments in the film where I could tell what was going to happen, but yet it had all of these different elements. It was incredibly sleazy. One of the sleaziest movies I think I've ever seen. Definitely, probably out of the films that I've seen of Jess Franco thus far, definitely the sleaziest movie. So it's like a sex exploitation kind of thing in the beginning, and there's like full frontal nudity and all these things. But then you get into the horror element, and you don't see it coming, and then it has this the central piece of the film is a zombie movie, but then it goes way into this other direction. So you never know where it's going to go. I never knew where it was going to go, and it totally plays with your expectations, and you're at the end of the film, at the conclusion of the film, I literally was just like, what the fuck did I just watch? I remember watching it last night, and I was sitting on my couch, and I had just finished it, and for a few minutes after that I finished the movie, I was just, I think I said it out loud. I was just like, what the fuck did I just watch? Like, that was one of the most bizarre experiences I've ever had watching a movie. And I'm like, Jess Franco rules, like amazing. And the thing that I love so much about this film is that you just don't see anything coming. It plays with all of these different genres. The giallo thing, where it has this air of mystery and suspense, the horror elements, it's got that going on. It's got a little bit of this comedic thing going on at times, and it's got this kind of dirty, low down sex exploitation vibe, and it's all put in this like weird soup, and all brought to this boil. And the transfer of this film is just amazing. And like before, like I mentioned, Jess Franco was really known. He's still alive. There's a The special features on here are just so awesome. I watched Stephen Brower, who he does lots of commentaries, and this film came out on Severin. Severin is a one of the best companies around that specializes in all films in the exploitation world. They're just amazing. They really have an unbelievable selection of Jess Franco films. But Stephen Brower is also he contributes to all of the special features, and basically he's a published writer. He's got numerous books on that are about the horror exploitation world, the grindhouse cinema world. He's also written a couple of books about Jess Franco. I believe he was also involved with writing an autobiography. So this guy is incredibly knowledgeable. But there's an awesome interview with him, and that's one of the greatest things with these Severin packages for all of these great, crazy, these wild films. Stephen Brower contributes to all of the films and does all of these great deep dives and talks about these films, and it's amazing. It's a it's a listening to him talk is literally it's a like a film class, like a free movie education. And there's also, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm going to watch. It's probably tonight. There's an interview with Jess Franco himself on here. But Severin is just amazing, and the quality, the transfer of the film taken from the original negative of the original film, transferred to digital for their Blu-ray releases, and in particular with this film, is just gorgeous. It's amazing. The music, the audio, everything being remixed and put in these packages and formatted for these packages is incredible. And that's the other thing. Severin has really great prices, so their films are like relatively cheap, but so worth it. So psyched that I bought this film. I can't wait to watch it again. Again, Jess Franco is like kind of emerging as easily now he's one of my favorite directors. And again, it was one of those things of where as a kid I saw a few of his films, had no idea that he had over 100 films to his credit, and I had no idea that he played in all different genres of films. So rediscovering him, fairly recently has just been an awesome experience. Just tremendous. I mean, and that's the other thing that about his work and at least the films that I've been buying is that they're so diverse. Like each film is like he's got a very distinct style, where he messes with the viewer's expectations and doesn't really concern himself as a filmmaker with like having any kind of conventional um, approach. He'll like intentionally kind of mess with that. But the thing that I love is like how diverse his films are. Some of his films, I did a show on a couple of his earlier films before where they're like straight up giallo films. They're not really horror. They're pretty strange. They have a little bit of a horror element, but they're more of like a murder mystery kind of a thing. And it's just gorgeous visually, and his films always, and those films in particular, they're just really bright and beautiful. And this movie is very dark and beautiful at the same time, but just incredibly dark and creepy, and the atmosphere is just amazing. But again, definitely one of the most bizarre films I have ever seen. And I just love this film. It's just such a trip. So, yeah, anybody out there and I know there's a lot of folks who do love and who are aware of Jess Franco as a director. But even if you're not, I mean, if you want one hell of a trip of a movie experience, I highly recommend anything by Jess Franco. But in particular, Mansion of the Living Dead. Like this movie is purely a Gonzo experience. It's such a trip. So thanks again for everyone for supporting my channel. And if you like these weird little videos that I do, please like and subscribe to my channel. It's greatly appreciated. I really love that people have been checking out the videos. I've been, just within the last few days, a few of the other videos I've been posting that I have up have, gotten pretty high views, in the thousands. So I really appreciate that. It feels really great to feel that there are people out there that care about this weird shit. So, and again, at the end of the day, it's really about bringing light to these, incredibly strange films and movies that are, to a degree, were maybe, at one point forgotten about. But if you're a fan of film, and you want a unique experience, that's where it's at. And so at the end of the day, it's about the films and trying to, bring light to certain filmmakers that you might not have heard of, or a director you might know of, but you didn't the same situation for me. You might not have realized that they had this, extensive career of, where they made all of these films. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean, and thanks again for all the support. And have a great day, and we will see you next time. Peace.